Okay. Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's webinar, Study Methods for the Natural Sciences, presented by the American Student Dental Association and sponsored by the American Dental Association and Memorang. Tonight's program will go over methods of not only learning the natural sciences information, but retaining it as well. After the presentation, we will open up the webinar for your questions. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. All attendees are muted so that we don't pick up any background noise during the program. The webinar will be recorded and posted on ASDA's website. A link will be emailed to all who have registered for the webinar. You will notice a control panel on the right side of the screen. You can type your question into the screen, and I will say the question aloud for all the attendees. You can direct your question to a specific panelist or leave it general, and one of the panelists will respond. My name is Brian Jones, and I'm ASDA's Membership Development Manager. I'll be serving as the facilitator for tonight's program. ASDA has a staff of 14 association professionals in our central office located in Chicago. I have worked for ASDA for more than 18 months, and my main responsibility is creating and managing initiatives to increase pre-dental membership and involvement in ASDA. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have regarding ASDA membership. I also serve as staff liaison to ASDA's Pre-Dental Advisory Committee, the Pre-Dental Planning Committee, and the ASIDP Committee. Tonight's panelists include Dr. Yermie Cohen, forgive me if I'm butchering your name, Yermie from UCLA School of Dentistry, class of 19. She scored a 22 in the biology section of the DAT. Gurpreet Singh from UCLA as well, class of 19. Even with extenuating circumstances, scored a 21 on general chemistry. And then Benny Statman from UCLA, class of 19, whose academic average score was a 26. I would now like to introduce our main presenter, Dr. Yermie Cohen. Yermie is the CEO and co-founder for Memorang, an adaptive web and mobile learning platform that uses artificial intelligence to help students master complex topics according to their own pace and style. Yermie obtained his MD from UCLA, and he also studied mechanical engineering and biology at MIT. I'm now going to turn over the presentation to Yermie. Yermie, if you want to go, perfect.
Hey guys, is my webcam on?
Yes, your webcam's on.
Okay. Hey guys, so I'm Yermie, and I'm going to go over a few study methods for the natural sciences section of the DAT. In many ways, the DAT and MCAT are similar in the same ways that dental school and medical school are similar. And as pre-dental, pre-health students, we face the same types of difficulties. And by difficulties, it really means stress, because there's so much that goes into preparing for these exams and getting admitted into school. So I'm happy to answer any questions you guys have, and the techniques that I'm giving you today are not just for the DAT, and they're not just for dental school. They're study techniques that will help regardless of what type of material that you're learning. So hopefully you can take the lessons that you get from today and apply them throughout your academic career. So now I'm going to switch over to showing my screen. Brian, can you confirm that my screen is showing?
Yes, we're good.
Okay, so it's showing my presentation?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. So, as I said, today we're going to go over some study methods for the natural sciences, and these study methods can be used regardless of what type of tools you use, whether they're digital or whether you're taking notes by hand, stone tablet, whatever it is that works for you. These methods are cognitive principles that can be applied. So when I was a med student, this is my notes from a single lecture on microbiology. And when you're in dental school, you'll face something similar. As trying to learn this type of material, you can imagine that it's overwhelming. And so as an engineering major, I didn't really have the right skill sets for this type of massive type of memorization that I needed to do. So I was inspired by my frustration to try and create an adaptive learning tool that would help take information like this and then make it easy so that even people like me could learn it. And you know, I didn't hit the ground running in med school. It wasn't that easy for me, and in fact, I struggled a lot on the initial exams. But through applying rigorous principles, I was able to rise to the 99th percentile nationally. So that's not really a talent issue. It's more about putting your efforts in the right place. So my background, as Brian had mentioned, is that I studied mechanical engineering and biology at MIT, and then I went on to medical school where I got my MD from UCLA. One of my best friends and also the technical lead for Memorang is my buddy George Kortsunis, who also was a computer scientist at MIT and worked for a number of Silicon Valley companies before dipping his toe into education. So in this presentation, we're going to go over three main things that I want you to take away. The first is an overview of the DAT Natural Sciences section. The second are specific techniques to improve your knowledge retention, and we'll go over a few DAT practice questions. And the third is talking about how maybe a program like Memorang and ASDA's DAT study tool might be able to help. So, for those of you who aren't familiar with the DAT Natural Sciences section, it's 100 multiple choice questions that you have to complete in 90 minutes. So on average, that's about 66 seconds per question. However, there are three main sections that you need to master. The first is biology, where there are 40 questions. And the biology questions tend to be more of knowledge retention, the types of things that you can memorize or integrate relatively quickly. And for that reason, we recommend that you take about 30 seconds per question, so about 20 minutes of the total 90. The second section is general chemistry. The general chemistry section is a bit harder because there's equations to solve. And for that reason, we recommend that you allot about 75 seconds per question, so that's a minute 15. The third is organic chemistry, which is everyone's favorite subject. And that's a little bit harder than biology because there's patterns that you have to recommend. You can't just rely off your memory. And for that reason, we recommend about 60 seconds or a minute each. And that gives you about 2.5 minutes to spare. So when you're studying and doing practice questions, you should be shooting to hit under this number as you get better at this content. To go in a little bit more detail, these are some of the sections from biology. The two biggest ones are cell and molecular biology and anatomy and physiology. Luckily for you guys, this is more of straight memorization, so there's a finite amount of knowledge that you could acquire to do well in this section. There are two main skills that you need to master in order to do well in biology. The first is memorization, and the second is knowledge integration. And what I mean by knowledge integration is that if you think of memorizing something as like two sides of a flashcard, an A and a B side, that's like a single link in the chain. Knowledge integration means that you take multiple links in the chain and you follow a logical conclusion, kind of like problem solving. If one part of that chain is broken, you've missed the whole question, and that's why it's so important that you don't have any gaps in your knowledge. The second section is general chemistry. General chemistry, as I said, is a little bit more difficult when you're doing these practice questions. You have the minute 15 per question, and it's very, very evenly divided between a lot of different subjects. There is a heavy dose of memorization because you need to know general principles, you need to know things like nomenclature, and you also need to have equations memorized. However, no two questions are ever really going to be the same, and so that's why the main skill that you're going to use here is conceptual application. The third section is organic chemistry. Organic chemistry is very, very interesting. It's like learning a completely different language. And similar to that analogy of language, you need to have a vocabulary. So the vocabulary is knowing the different molecules and basic reactions like SN1, SN2, and others. Then what you do is that you are able to use these general principles and then apply them in ways that you've never seen. And if you have a really good grasp of the principles, it doesn't matter how scary the molecules they throw at you, you can break it down into little things that you understand, and from that you can reason out the right answer. So That's just an overview of the DAT Natural Sciences section. Now we're going to talk about how we actually master these different portions. So the first thing I have to say is don't do this. This is spinning your wheels in the mud. A lot of students think that just because you are working hard that you're learning, but that couldn't be farther from the truth. A lot of the times when you have that really smart classmate who seems like they have a photographic memory or they're not really studying that much, it's not that they're naturally a genius, although sometimes they are. What it really is that they're applying their energy in a way that's very efficient. I can't tell you how many times that I've seen students say, oh, I've been studying for 12 or 14 hours a day, but it's not sticking. Well, the reason it's not sticking is because they're stuck in the mud. And what I'm going to tell you is a few ways that you can make your minutes of studying more efficient. So let's talk about the 3 types of studying for something like test prep. It doesn't matter whether you're studying for the DAT, the MCAT, the NBDE, the USMLE, or even like the GMAT. There's 3 types of studying that you need to do for test prep. The first is primary learning. So primary learning is when you're introduced to a concept and you start to understand it. So primary learning is usually in the form of videos that you watch on YouTube, lectures that you've gone to in class, or textbooks that you've picked up and that you're reading the raw information. So essentially primary learning is your reference material. The second part is retention, which means that there are certain core concepts or high yield points that you need to be able to take away from that primary learning. Retention is basically what you would write on a cheat sheet if you were allowed to take it into the exam, essentially an open note exam. And what I try and tell students is that if you have a really good memory, it's like taking an open book exam. But then they say, oh, well, you know, not everyone can be that way. But the truth is that the brain, human brain, is quite limitless. And so if you use the right type of principles, you can actually memorize as much information as you need, kind of like having an open book test. The third is application. This is pretty self-explanatory. It's actually taking the knowledge that you have and applying it in practice tests and practice questions. Where students tend to fall apart is that they jump from primary learning straight to application. And a lot of the reasons why they get certain questions wrong is because they didn't remember something. In my opinion, if you are doing practice questions and you're getting things wrong because you don't remember them, you're wasting those practice questions. You're wasting that opportunity to take that knowledge and apply it in new ways. Because if your knowledge deficit is what's causing the problem, then what you need to do is fix that instead of doing more practice questions on those focused topics. So here are 5 ways that you can improve your memory so that you can do better on your practice questions. And in the left column, I talk about what you should do and what research says you should do. And in the right column, I say what students typically do. So what you should do to not have your wheels spinning in the mud is active recall. What students typically do is that they say, well, you know, I prefer to watch videos because I learn that way, or I like to read the textbook, or things like that. The problem is that if you're not engaging with the material, it's called passive learning. And passive learning has about 10% efficacy versus active recall, which is closer to 90%. So you would have to study 9 times as much using passive learning to get the same benefit from active recall. So active recall means you're always in the process of quizzing yourself, meaning that you're never showing yourself the answer before you try and retrieve it from your brain first. The low-tech version of this is that you cover a paragraph with your hand and you try and predict in the textbook what it's going to say in the next paragraph. Or if you're sitting around with your friends and you're quizzing each other on various topics, like what's an SN1 reaction, or what is the function of the adrenal glands in anatomy. So the second thing that you should do is something that's called overlearning. And this is one of the hardest habits to break. What happens is when students are studying something, they get to the point where they feel familiar with the material and they say, oh, well, you know, I think I got it. And then they move on to the next topic. The problem is that what you really need to do is that you need to beat it like a dead horse. Essentially, the level of familiarity you need to have with the topic needs to be so extreme that you are bored and annoyed when someone asks you that question. For example, if you didn't know that epinephrine helped increase blood pressure and I quizzed you on it, and I quizzed you on it every hour, Eventually, you get to the point where that became secondhand knowledge, and that's the degree to which you need to push yourself to master a topic. If you stop at the point of fluency or familiarity, then you're going to forget it on exam day when you're under stress and there's a lot of things going through your mind. The second thing is actually a pretty easy thing to do. It's called contextual variability. Contextual variability is something that's been discovered in a lot of research that shows if you study something in a different way, the more different ways that you study it, the better you're going to understand it. And if you know anything about neuroscience, you know that your brain has all these neurons that link to different things. And kind of like navigating, if you were to say that you were driving to a certain location, like driving to school every day, if you took the same path every day, you would know that path very well. But what happens if you start from someone else's house? You might be a little bit lost. So the concept of where school is located is kind of like learning an important concept on the DAT exam. So the more routes you take to your destination, the better you're going to understand it. So how do you do that in practice? One is that you can try different modes of study, like flashcards, multiple choice, or playing games. Another is, which is actually pretty simple, is that you can just study in different places. For example, let's say you're studying OChem. You can start by studying in the library one day, and then the next time you study that same topic, you study at home, and the next time you study in a coffee shop. And having that different environment around you each time that you study is actually going to lead to greater retention of that material. The fourth thing is called interleaving, which means that when you study something in a random order, you remember it better than if you always study it in the same order every time. So if what you find yourself doing is that you're always reading through the textbook or reading through your self-notes in the same way, try randomizing it a bit. The next thing is weekly recaps. Retention and repetition is the key here. So every week, what you should be doing, whether you're studying in college or for your test prep exams, is that you should be taking time to go over everything you've learned and reiterate it. And that's something that you should work into your schedule. For example, like if you have a 10-week study schedule, you should set aside one day where all you do that day is go over previous material as opposed to going over new material. So let's do a few practice question examples. The first one, this is a biology question. It might be a little bit on the hard side, and honestly, this is even easier than what you'll see in dental school, but it's useful to try and develop these types of skills early so that after you do well in your exam and you get admitted to dental school, you're even more well prepared as a first and second year student. So I'll read it out loud. A neuroendocrine tumor of the adrenal medulla releases a certain hormone at abnormally high levels. Which of the following symptoms would be observed in a patient with such a tumor? A, pupil constriction. B, abnormally low heart rate. C, reduced blood pressure. D, elevated blood pressure. E, decreased blood flow to skeletal muscles. Now, this question requires that you know a few things in order to get it right. But if you know these two facts, this question is something that you can answer probably in less than 5 seconds. So let's go over the next slide. There's two things we need to know about. First is the adrenals, which is to know what hormone is being produced, because we said adrenal medulla. And the second is what is that hormone and what does it do? So we said that it was the adrenal medulla. And if you had memorized the different functions of the adrenal gland, you would know that the cortex produces aldosterone, cortisol, and sex hormones like androgens. So those would include like testosterone and estrogen and DHEA. The medulla, which is a different part of the adrenal, produces epinephrine and norepinephrine, also known as adrenaline and noradrenaline. So if you knew at least that what the adrenal medulla did, you're halfway there. You know the adrenal medulla produces epinephrine. But like I said earlier, solving these types of integrated questions are like links in the chain. And one weak link means that you get the question wrong. So we have the first link here. So what's the second? We have epinephrine. So what are the four main functions of epinephrine that we might be interested in here? The first is pupil dilation, because it's your flight or fight response. If you imagine a cat who's scared, does their pupil get smaller? Does their pupil get larger? Second is increased blood glucose, increased vasoconstriction. Vasoconstriction means to constrict your blood vessels. And then the last is to increase heart rate. So The two things that we needed to know here was that the medulla produced epinephrine and that we increased heart rate. So let's go back to the question. Okay, so really all this question is asking is which of the following is a function of epinephrine? Seems like a pretty simple question. So pupil constriction, well, that's the opposite, right? Because the scared cat has dilated pupils. Low heart rate, that doesn't sound like fight or flight. That sounds like rest and digest. Reduced blood pressure versus elevated blood pressure. Well, if your heart rate is increasing, your blood pressure is going to go. If you're constricting your blood vessels, you're increasing the pressure. And then E, decreased blood flow to skeletal muscles. Well, part of the flight, of the fight or flight, is that you want to get a lot of blood to your legs so you can run away. So the only reasonable choice here is D. And if you had memorized and you knew these different things about adrenals and epinephrine, this is a giveaway question, as opposed to an impossible question. So let's go over a chemistry example. Which of the following particles has the highest penetrating power? So this is a nuclear question. We have different particles here, and then we have gamma rays. So essentially we need to know which of these are going to go through the most material. And again, this is the type of thing that is knowledge retention. So protons don't really have penetrating power because they're not traveling anywhere. And positrons are essentially just positively charged electrons, and they're like protons. They're not like traveling through the air, piercing things. So let's focus on the other three that matter. Alpha particles are stopped by human skin, not very powerful. Beta particles are stopped by aluminum foil, which is a little bit thicker than human skin, or a little bit denser, I should say. And then gamma rays are what give you cancer if you're exposed to them. So 3 inches lead or 3 feet of concrete. So the reasonable answer here is gamma rays. So this is a giveaway question if you know the different materials of these. So that's like an overview of how you would apply some of these principles to solving practice questions. So now I'm going to give a quick overview of Memorang and ASDA. So what is Memorang? You know, it started as my own frustration because I wasn't able to learn things as fast as I wanted to in med school, and then we opened it up as a way for students from all disciplines to study. So what our goal is that we can go grade school through grad school and give students a free learning tool that they can use for whatever subject that they're learning. So, I mean, it's going well so far. We have over 100,000 people using it. Students have uploaded at least 15 million of their own flashcards. Over 50 million of them have been studied, and we have hundreds of thousands of premium facts. One of the goals here, and we talked about contextual variability, is that you can switch wherever you're studying, whether it's in the library, outside. And part of that is because you can use mobile apps or a web platform. The next is that you can actually study in different ways. So you can use flashcards, but you could also use multiple choice questions. You could use matching games. You can even play Space Invaders like an Eliminator. So the way it works is that this is a free platform, kind of like if you guys have ever used Quizlet or StudyBlue. There's free content out there. You can create flashcards with your friends, and you can group them into playlists. What we've done with ASDA, however, is that we've done some of the hard work for you in that we've compiled all of the facts that you need to know for the natural sciences into one place. So this was actually a pretty ambitious project. It took a very long time to put together. And what we've done is that we've gone through each of the core learning objectives for the DAT, for the natural sciences. We've made those into flashcards and questions that you can practice. We've put it on a website, an iOS and Android app, so you can switch between devices when you're studying. And we made sure to cover all of the top resources like Kaplan's DAT books, Cliff's AP Bio, Organic Chemistry as a Second Language, and more. And what we've actually done is we've listed the page numbers, so if you have those textbooks, you don't even have to create flashcards. You could go straight to Memorang, and you can use ASDA's content. So that's a brief overview. If you guys have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Okay, before we go to the Q&A, I'm going to turn it over to the students from UCLA if they'd like to introduce themselves and if they have any comments.
Hi, I'm Mariah Aaron. I'm a second-year dental student at UCLA. My interests outside of, or my major focus in dental school, I guess, is oral surgery. I also do research on the side. My ASDA involvement is mostly philanthropy, types of events, and yeah, that's me.
Hi, I'm Gurpreet Singh, also a second-year dental student at UCLA. My main involvement at UCLA is with research, as I'm a GDS PhD student. As far as ASDA involvement, I was part of the HIV committee and pre-dental outreach.
Hi everybody, I'm Ben Statman, also second year here at UCLA. I would like to get involved in academia after dental school, as well as being a general dentist. I've been involved in ASDA's Special Needs Oral Health Committee, where we focus on providing oral hygiene to individuals who may not be able to, or may have unique needs, like patients with disabilities or patients who are pregnant, the geriatric community, and people like that. I've also been involved with ASDA's, at UCLA's ASDA's Ethics Society, where we kind of look at different situations that will come up, that frequently come up in both school and in private practice, and try to kind of determine the ethical way to deal with those problems.
Okay, so now we're going to turn this over to the Q&A portion. Let's see. The UCLA students, if you could turn on your webcam, a lot of these questions are going to be directed towards you. Okay, perfect. Our first question is, do you think biochemistry is essential to do well in the DAT?
I took biochemistry in undergrad. I actually took a full year, and the reason was because a lot of schools require you to take biochemistry to even apply. Did I feel like I needed biochemistry in the DAT? Probably not. I think you can do pretty well without it. There's lots of resources to study, and there really wasn't that much biochem on the exam.
Yeah, I think one thing that I would add is, with a lot of potential courses that you can take in undergrad will help you in your study. The more you know about a topic, the easier the questions you'll find it. But is it necessary? Maybe not. So, for example, personally, I took genetics. So when it came to studying for the DAT, all of the genetics questions were very basic for me, because I had a much deeper understanding of genetics. Would I have been able to perform on the genetics portion of biology on the DAT without it? Probably, but it definitely made it easier to do it with having that prior knowledge.
I was a biochemistry major during my undergrad, so it was required for me to take it, and I felt like even if I hadn't taken the class, I still would have done okay on the exam. But it did help bring the skills of integrating biology and chemistry together and seeing how you can go between different topics and see links between topics. And that helps out a lot during the DAT, since there's a lot of topics that are covered in both biology and chemistry, and you can establish links between them to help you get towards the answers quicker.
Okay, our next question is, I have DAT resources from 2014 editions. Do you think these are too outdated to study from in order to take the DAT this year?
So when I studied, my second time when I studied, I used resources that were 2 years prior, and I felt like they still covered everything that was going to be on the exam and what actually was on the exam. There were a few things that I felt like wasn't in those resources, but I had supplemented my studying with online flashcards and also just looking at different websites to see what kind of other chemistry, for biology, and like what other questions were there beyond just what was in the textbooks.
Yeah, I think that the good news is that for the most part, basic science hasn't changed. Definitely not in the last 2 years, probably, for the most part in the last 5 or 10 years. So most of the content itself for the DAT will be fairly constant. What I would recommend if you are going to use older resources is make sure to confirm with the official DAT documents to make sure of any changes that they may have made in the past few years. I know that there were talks about maybe changing the math section a few years ago. So you just want to, if you're using older resources, you just want to make sure to double check if there were any changes to the exam itself.
I don't have anything to add.
Okay, our next question is a little bit of a long one, so bear with me. I have a question regarding the anatomy and physiology section of the biology section. How far in depth should we study for anatomy and physiology? The human body is complicated and extensive. Do I study everything in anatomy?
I think it was heaviest in the physiology. So if anything, you need to know that more than like what muscle attaches here. I hadn't taken anatomy before taking the DAT or even before starting dental school. And I didn't think anatomy, like having taken anatomy or studying anatomy alone was necessary. However, there was quite a bit of physiology that I needed to know, which I had gotten, I felt, from enough of my classes and from studying the material that I didn't feel like I struggled terribly much on those questions.
I had taken both anatomy and physiology separately and felt that, like Mariah said, that it was mostly physiology that came up. As far as the anatomy was concerned, it was quite basic in terms of just understanding where things are anatomically and what their functions are, rather than knowing every little intricate detail about each part. So overall, it was more the anatomical location and how it relates to the physiology in that area and overall.
I basically agree with what both Rupert and Mariah said, that I also didn't take anatomy beforehand or physiology. And I think, yeah, you just want to know the basic structure and function and how those two relate. So, you want to know, what the structure of the stomach is and, why it has, maybe a mucus lining and how that relates to its function of, digesting food. So you want to know those types of things, but I don't think there was really anything on muscle attachments or too much on specific innervation of different muscles like you might see in a more in-depth anatomy course.
Okay, next question. For the guy that got a 26 on the DAT, what did you use to study?
So I used a combination of resources. I did take a Kaplan course, so I used those resources. I used the Cliff's AP for biology, an older book probably from when I was in high school, and I used the DAT Destroyer for practice problems, and I think that kind of ties in with what Yermie was saying before, that I use kind of the textbooks to kind of get a first pass at the information, to kind of be presented the information, and then I use as many practice problems as I could get my hands on to apply the information and kind of see how it was tested. But there wasn't really a resource like Memorang that kind of bridge that gap and give you the repetition and to really memorize it. So I kind of had to do that on my own. So I took notes on a lot of those resources to kind of use those to test myself.
The next question is directed at Yermie. Is there a fee for Memorang, and if so, what is it?
Sure, I'll share my webcam. So there's two versions of Memorang. There's the free version and then there's the paid version. The only difference is the content that you get access to. So creating an account is completely free and you can create your own flashcards and study everyone else. There's no fee associated with that. For the DAT, it's either a monthly fee or an annual fee. And I think the monthly fee starts at around $9.99 per month. But there's also a 30% discount you get at the end of this lecture. So one of our goals here is that we try and price things really, really low because it's important for us that as many students benefit. I hope that answers the question. But I also wanted to add one more thing because I was just reminded of this about where flashcards fit in with the overall scope. So there's two ways to think about what you're using flashcards for, because it's always repetition of things that you're reviewing. The first is from your primary resources. For example, notes that you're taking from lecture or textbooks. If you put these in flashcard form, it's a more active way to study your notes as opposed to passively rereading through them over and over again. So it actually makes your notes more powerful. The second is sometimes we learn things when we do practice questions, like there's a little fact that maybe wasn't covered in our textbooks. And what a lot of students have done in the past is that you take notes also the same way you do for lecture. There's this new paradigm that a lot of med students and dental students are using that's called keeping a question journal. In the past, that was writing out things that you had learned. But the new way to do that is you actually make flashcards from little things that you've gotten wrong or need to review from practice questions. So that's one technique that's really useful for active learning, and that's not something that costs anything.
Okay, and the next question, Yermie, is how long do you recommend we prepare for the DAT using Memorang's flashcards?
So it really depends on how much time that you have allocated for it. So a lot of students, what they do is if they have maybe 3 months allocated, the reality is that you can use it for a year in advance, or you could use it even for a few weeks in advance. So if you're going through some of these textbooks, like Organic Chemistry as a Second Language, or like the Cliff's AP Notes from Bio, you could take your time going through that, and then after you read a certain chapter, you can quiz yourself with the relevant flashcards. And you can even do that through your college course work. So my recommendation is that you start using it early, because the more repetitions you get, the more that you're going to know things off the back of your hand.
Okay. And the next question is directed towards anyone. In terms of studying the biology section, is it purely just memorization?
It's not necessarily memorization. There's also integration. So if you think of learning a language, there's grammar, there's sentences, but then there's also vocabulary. So for example, the question that we went through that talked about the adrenal glands, no one would really think that that question is a memorization question, because what you're doing is that you're linking things you know and applying it in a new way. And that application is not basic memorization. But the memorization is kind of the building blocks that allow you to do this higher order problem solving.
Next question. I have a weak background in natural science. I am planning on taking the DAT next year. Where do I start?
You guys can take this one.
I mean, you can start by looking at SDN to just figure out like what resources that you can start collecting. There's a lot of stuff that's available online, so you can look for those. And SDN has a lot of things that are posted on there. And I know there's also a schedule that's posted on there as like a planner that you can use. you can create your own based off of that, depending on where your circumstances are, if you're working or if you're a full-time student. First thing is just making a plan and gathering all your resources, and then going to study for it.
I'd also add that if you don't have a science background or a strong science background, you definitely want to make sure to allot more time, as long as you can, to digest the material, because a lot of the material is very dense and may seem very similar if you don't really take the time to really, I guess, analyze it and separate it and understand it. So you definitely don't want to cram it in. Take the time to really understand as many of the concepts as possible, and don't try to rush through the material.
Yeah, if you're a year out, start now. And start going through that passive learning that Yermie was talking about. Even using Memorang, you can look through the facts and the terms to like start getting familiar with terminology that you need to have down packed.
I would add one thing as well, which I didn't mention before, but there's a lot of research around cognitive science that shows that the best way to learn is to test. And the old classroom model was that we would go to lecture, we'd be introduced to a material, and then we'd go and maybe we'd have a quiz on it later. It sounds counterintuitive, but actually getting the quiz first before you've even become familiar with the material makes it so that when you do have that lesson, you're able to pay a lot more close attention and pick out what's relevant. It's like the example, like if you had done a lot of reading the night before a lecture, you're able to pick out a lot more from it. So you might be frustrated. You might like, I only got 1 out of 10 of these questions right, but that frustration primes you to pay attention in your reading to say, oh, well, this came up in a question. That seems really relevant. And with material that's really dense, this is a good way to glean the high yield points from it.
This next question is directed towards the UCLA students. Did any of you retake the DAT?
I took the retake for the DAT. Is there a question related to that, or just? Yeah,
the question was, what did you do differently the second time?
I studied more, and I definitely put more. So the first time I took it, I was focused more on my work that I was doing, and I didn't have too much time to devote to studying for the DAT, and I kind of just went in and took it. Bad approach. Even though I had a background with biochemistry as my major. So the second time I prepared for it, I did a lot more practice exams. Some of them are released online, so I used those, and some I used questions from just anything that I could find online that had DAT type of questions. So I used that, and it was just spending more time and focusing on my weak areas after I went through a practice exam, and seeing, as Yermie was saying, making a note of like which part that you got wrong, so when it comes up again, you're more aware of that, and you can build on your weaknesses in that way.
I think one other reason that a lot of people retake the DAT is the test experience itself. They may not have been prepared for. So one thing that I would recommend is make sure to understand the format of the test. If you have the release test, you can work on it, work under test-like conditions when you are taking practice tests. So if you're signed up to take the test in the morning, take your practice test in the morning, take it in silence, don't have your cell phone with you. Try to limit yourself to, the 2 sheets of scratch paper that you'll have. If you can get a dry erase board and a marker, the more that you create those test-like conditions beforehand, the more comfortable you'll feel when actually in the testing environment.
Yeah, so I actually had a few released exams that I used, like full-length exams, And I did them, so I would go through study material and flashcards, and then I would do an exam every like 2 or 3 days, and I'd sit down, make it like exam conditions, since I had taken it already, so I knew like how it was. So I would sit down, nothing in my room, I was just sitting at a desk and took the exam as if I was taking it at the learning center. And by that time, when I did go and take the second exam, it was just, oh, I'm taking another exam. It wasn't this grandiose thing like, this is the DAT I'm taking.
Okay. This question is directed to all the panelists. What year in school were you when you started to prepare for the DAT? How many weeks did you dedicate to preparing, and how many hours per day?
I passively started relatively early. I can't remember exactly how early, probably like a year in advance. I was like, oh, I'm taking this in the future, so I possibly would look through stuff, but it was not committed and there was no like schedule to it. I actually took the DAT form like right after a semester, and it was during a very full semester for me. So I began studying, I guess, hard, I think about 4 months before, and I would spend a number of hours per day. I probably did a couple hours, an hour to 2 hours per day, and then on the weekend, like on a Saturday, I actually dedicated that to like my practice test day. And make sure when you do the practice tests, something that I didn't hear mentioned was the timing needs to be, like, keep the timing accurate to what the actual testing conditions are going to be, because it's a lot more of a fast-paced exam than even practicing sometimes prepares you for. So that was my thing.
So initially I had wanted to go into dentistry when I started undergrad, but along the way I got heavily involved in research. So after my undergrad, I was just working, so I took time off between undergrad and dental school, and I didn't start, I took the first exam, and then I didn't start actually studying for the second one until about 2 months out, and I was still working full-time at the time. I devoted anywhere between 4 to 5 hours during the week, and then I do about 8 to 10 on the weekend. And this was on like my work schedule. But yeah, like most of my studying was done in those last 2 months or so before the application cycle was opening. I decided very late that I was going to be applying to that cycle, so something to be aware of.
What I did was I was scheduled to take the exam at the end of June, and I signed up for a course that ran from December to March, and I basically used the course to kind of pace myself to make sure that I was at least getting a little bit of a look at the material beforehand. I knew I wasn't going to be studying particularly seriously at that point because I had a very full semester. Around a month and a half before the exam is when I kind of began to really buckle down and really spend significant amounts of time. So I probably, the last month before the exam, I probably spent about 8 hours a day. And I would just kind of do practice problems and then review all of the practice problems to figure out, the ones that I got wrong, why I got them wrong, the ones that I got right. If I didn't, absolutely, I couldn't eliminate all of the wrong answers and know the right answer, figure out why the wrong answers were wrong and why the right answer was right. So I did that for about the last month before the exam. But there's no magic formula, and you definitely don't want to burn yourself out. So don't try to, just go 2 or 3 months, 8 to 9 hours a day.
Yeah, and also make sure you take a day or so off from studying right before you go and take your actual exam. you don't want to be burnt out by the time you're actually taking the actual DAT exam.
Next question is for Yermie. Is it possible to integrate your own notes and questions into the DAT questions on Memorang?
Yeah, so what you can do, if you're familiar with Spotify or iTunes, it's the same kind of thing where on Memorang you can create playlists. And so your playlist, you can put any content in there. So it could be your own notes, it could be your friend's notes, and it could be the premium notes. So if you made a playlist called like Yermie's playlist or my DAT stuff to review, you could add your own notes and other notes in there. And in medical school, what we've seen a lot is that students will be taking a subject that overlaps with the premium content. Like maybe in med school, they'll study microbiology. They'll take microbiology flashcards, and then they'll take extra notes from lecture, and then they'll study those notes together to kind of give them a head start in what they're doing in courses.
The next question is for the UCLA students. Is it more effective to study all topics at once or one topic at a time?
A little overwhelming to do everything at once. You definitely need to give time to each topic.
Initially, I studied individual topics, but towards the later end of my studying, I started mixing them around just so that I would not be in this zone of like, this is what I'm expecting next and this is what I'm expecting next. Instead, it helped make like links between the different topics, and as I said earlier, that helped out a lot like during the exam. So I would say focus on one subject matter at a time initially, and then if you do have time, try to switch off between different ones to see if you can see any like similarities or overlaps between them.
Do you guys recommend taking a DAT prep course?
I took a DAT prep course, and I definitely don't think it's necessary. I used it as a way to ensure that I was pacing myself, that I wouldn't put off the studying, because I knew that the course met at whatever time it was, and I had to have seen the material at that point. So for me, I used the course not necessarily for the information that it presented, as much as to keep myself paced. So if I think if you feel that you can maintain your own pace and can be disciplined to stick with that pace, then there's definitely not a need for a course.
I agree. I took a prep course and it was not necessary, but it allowed me, just like Benny said, it was structured and you had a beginning and an end, and it forced you to come and study at these times, which is very helpful if you have a crazy busy schedule, which most pre-dental students do. So it's not necessary, but it is helpful in that type of circumstance.
I just add one other thing. The other benefit that I think my course had was it had online practice exams that were formatted in the same way that the testing center, the DAT is formatted in the testing center. So it helped with recreating the test-like conditions. So you were on a computer and the screen was designed the exact same way. So that was another benefit of having that resource.
And then Yermie, can the flashcards in Memorang be listened to as audio?
Not right now, although that's pretty interesting. I imagine they're talking about text-to-speech. Something we've thought about adding it, but yeah, let's add that to our list of intended features.
One of the panelists recommended taking practice exams. How many practice exams should I take?
I don't think there's a limit to too many. Maybe you can get your hands on, because the more questions that you're seeing, the wording and the way things are asked and forcing you to apply the knowledge that you know is only going to help you. I can't see how the more practice exams you do could hurt you. I think I did one every Saturday for however many I got my hands on. I don't know the exact number, but it was a lot.
Yeah. One of the resources that I used, I had about 7 or 8 full-length practice exams from. So I did all of those, and then I did the ones that are released from ASDA. I've taken like the released exams. I've taken all of those, and just finding other ones that are available. So just overall, I think the second time around, I probably took about like 10 or 15, somewhere in between there. But like she said, there's no maximum or minimum limit to how many practice exams you do. It's more being exposed to the way that the questions are written and phrased on the DAT and how to go about solving them.
And I agree that there definitely is no limit, and the more the merrier. But you definitely want to make sure that you're spacing it out. So if you find that you're not, answering as many questions as you would like to, don't necessarily stick with questions. Maybe go back to the material. So you don't want to only focus on the questions. If you're not getting as many questions as you want, go back to the material and try to refresh the material. Use flashcards, use whatever resources you have, and then after that, go back to another practice test to kind of gauge if that helped.
Okay. I'm a current Memorang user and love it. Can you make any recommendations on what materials would supplement Memorang's flashcards?
Well, I mean, the Memorang flashcards are created from the resources that a lot of other pre-dental students do use. Something that I think could help you supplement it is if you can find other DAT flashcard sets that pre-dental students have created, and you can use those to supplement. Aside from that, I would say if you are an NSM major in your undergrad, just look at the different classes that are available, some that may be elective classes or selective classes. See if you might be able to take those just to boost like what you're learning from Memorang.
Okay, I'm studying for the MCAT already to take before the DAT. Will I be okay for the natural sciences section?
I didn't take the MCAT.
Maybe Yermie would.
Yeah.
Best.
Yeah, so there is a tremendous amount of overlap. In fact, a lot of the resources that are recommended, for example, organic chemistry, are the same resources used for the DAT as the MCAT exam. So for the organic chemistry, I think you're well taken care of, and same with biology. And chemistry as well. The only thing that I would do is I would look up the learning objectives published by the AAMC and compare those to the learning objective listed for the DAT and see if there's any particular concept that doesn't overlap, because you should be able to supplement on that specifically. But from what I have seen, it is almost studying for the same exam. But if you're looking for that really high score, I still think that you should look at the bullet points between the DAT and the MCAT. And in fact, it's such an interesting question, I think we'll write a blog post about it.
We are getting a lot of questions about the PAT. I just want to let everybody know that tomorrow's webinar, Dissecting the DAT, will focus on the PAT. So we will be providing a link at the end of the webinar on the Dissecting the DAT webinar. So just sit tight for that, but that really will focus on the PAT. Sorry, we're getting a flurry of questions here. Let me just weed through them here. Can the panelists speak on the most challenging aspects of the DAT?
During the exam, the most challenging thing was probably the timing. I never felt this is a big standardized test. I mean, for my career, I don't think the time before that I took a big standardized test was the FAC. When I was in college, none of the exams. I had exams that had time crunches, but not to the extent that the standardized test is. And if I remember correctly, it's 5 or 6 hours or something. I don't know. 4 hours. 4 hours. I'm sorry, it's been a long time since I actually took the test and remember the timing. But it's a very long exam, and definitely by the end of the test, I was worn out. So that was the hardest part for me.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. There's like, aside from the natural sciences section, even in the other sections, there's a lot that you barely have a minute for a question, and it's your recall has to be really good, and you need to be pretty good at reading the question, since some are lengthy. So that was a little challenging, is just figuring out the timing of it, but the more practice exam you do under those timed conditions, the better you'll be able to deal with that.
Yeah, and not to get too off topic and get onto the tomorrow's topic, I guess, but for me personally, top front end in the PAT was a very challenging section. And I think a lot of things in PAT are things that you've never seen before, so you obviously want to take time to get exposed to them. But definitely I think endurance for the exam is big, because generally in the last 2 sections on the exam, which are the reading comprehension and mathematics, or the quantitative, you really are, if you don't take practice tests and take these full-length exams, you might be great at those topics, but after a long time of sitting in an exam, you begin to get tired. So you really need to train for the length of the exam.
Okay. I just want to remind all the attendees that the coupon code for Memorang's flashcards will be listed on the final slide. So just sit tight, and we'll give you plenty of time to write it down. We'll also be emailing it to all the attendees as well. The next question is to the UCLA students. How much time do you estimate that you spent on each section of the DAT?
I spent a lot of time on OChem. It was my weak subject, so I spent probably 3 times as much on OChem as I did on Gen Chem, and that was just based on my background. So it depends on the topics that you're studying. Some that you'll have a natural ability at, and so you won't have to spend too much time on those, whereas other ones where you guys are going to have gone through all of these classes during your undergrad, so you'll know which topics that you have issues with or have trouble with, so you can take time and focus on those a little bit more than the ones that come more naturally to you.
Okay, on Memorang, you mentioned the resources you collected your material from. For example, are there playlists dedicated to each resource, like the Cliffs AP Bio book?
So what we've done is that the playlist follows the learning objectives and categories of the exam, and then within each playlist we have what are called study sets, which are focused for each objective, and those study sets list the resources and page numbers that correspond to those concepts. However, later this year, what we'll be doing is adding a new concept called references. And using this concept of references, you'll be able to filter individual flashcards by the page range and the resource that they correspond to. So for example, if you had the Cliff's AP biology notes, you could say page 60 through 75, which I just read, and you could see the relevant flashcards. But that's something that will be later this year.
Okay, and then do you recommend to continue studying even 2 days before the exam, or is it healthy or advisable to give rest to your brain once you feel you are prepared?
I think Gurpreet said.
I think the exam that you're not going to learn anything more in the last 2 days. However, I'm the type that needs to be looking at something, and if I'm just sitting there and watching a movie or something, which is often what I hear recommended right before a big standardized test, that's going to make me more anxious. So I'm the type that just needs to be looking at something, although I know I'm not learning it. So yeah, but it is a good idea not to be doing your heavy studying in the last 2 days, because you're really not gonna, it's not gonna sit with you. It's not gonna hurt you.
I went sailing before my exam. I had studied like pretty intensely in those last few weeks, so I needed a break from it, and I just needed to like get away from studying for the DAT and being DAT all the time.
I'd like to add something here, although not necessarily for the DAT. When I took the USMLE Step 1 exam, which is the first round of medical boards in med school, it's about like a 9 or 10 hour exam. I made the mistake of studying right up until throughout the very last day, and I was so on edge that I actually couldn't fall asleep that night. And so by the time I finished my exam, I had been awake for 48 hours. Don't make that mistake. When I took my second round of board exams, I had learned from it, and I had done a lot of the things that the panelists have all said to do, like recreate my testing environment, take days off before, do light studying, and it just felt like another day going through. And so I was able to finish early, and I scored very, very well in 99th percentile, and I credit that mostly to the psychological preparation as opposed to the like knowledge-based preparation. So whether it's a 5-hour exam or a 9-hour exam, giving your brain some time to rest actually might consolidate your memories and put you more at ease.
I'm taking the DAT without Orgo 2. I have heard that there is more Orgo 1 material than Orgo 2 in the DAT. Is that the case?
So from again, I think they have different questions on every exam. I personally felt that my exam was more heavily weighted towards the Orgo 1 material, but there are a significant enough number of Orgo 2 questions that were covered that I definitely wouldn't neglect it. So yeah, maybe focus more time towards Orgo 1, but definitely don't neglect Orgo 2.
I had waited to take Orgo 2 before I took the DAT, personally.
For my exam, I felt like it was more weighted towards Orgo 2 than Orgo 1. So if you're worried about that, I would use the Memorang organic chemistry section, and if you need you want to supplement that with anything, whatever pre-dental website or student forum that you look at, they will suggest Chad's videos. So that's something you can supplement if you are in a situation where you don't have the time to take the Orgo 2 class and you have to take the DAT as soon as possible. I would just supplement it, the Memorang studying, with whatever other resources you can find.
Okay, is the Memorang up-to-date material for the 2017 DAT?
Yermie?
Yeah, in fact, we are updating it. One of the things that we do, because the content is hosted through the internet, is that we update it basically every week. So if there is something that's out of date, we either proactively update it, or we also take suggestions from people that say, you know what, when I took the DAT, my exam had a heavy focus on this, and so we'll go back through and we'll add even more content in that direction. And so that's one of the benefits, is that it's not like you're stuck with a textbook where you say, okay, this is the material that we have. It's an ever-evolving set of information that's always with us trying to keep up to date with whatever the exam is putting out there.
Is there an additional discount on Memorang if you're an ASDA member?
Yeah, there is an ASDA discount, and there's also a discount here. However, you can just use whichever of the two is greater.
Okay, we are getting some repeat questions here. Let's see. To the UCLA panelists, were there any particular practice exams you felt were stronger than others?
I think the released exams are as close to accurate as you'll see because they are the released exams. Those were the questions that were used. You know, all the other resources are trying to base their questions off of the similar style. So definitely, you know, the released exams I thought personally were the closest to the actual exam.
I agree with Benny. I took a lot of other ones besides the released ones, and the ones that were released, and those ones were by far the most similar and the ones that resembled the exams that I took.
Next question is, did any of you do group study to prepare for the DAT, or would you just study alone?
I didn't have the capability to do group study, but I would probably consider it if I did have that as an option.
I did self-study just by myself. I didn't really know any other pre-null students in the area, so that was my situation. But even if I did, I'd probably still study on my own just because people have different paces. So if you know somebody who has a similar pace to yours and a similar learning style, or even a different learning style, since you can learn from each other, I'd say you should give it a shot and see how it goes for you.
And then what studying methods did not work for you? That's directed to each of the panelists.
I think for me, at least, when I took the class, sitting in the class and listening to somebody kind of teach the information wasn't necessarily very helpful for me because some of the material I was pretty strong on and some of the material I was not very strong on. You know, and I felt that it wasn't necessarily moving at the pace that I needed. And I think especially for the DAT where you're going to have sections that you're strong on and weak on, you want that really individualized pace when you're going. So that was something personally for me that wasn't very helpful.
For me, just sitting and reading for a long time, that wasn't really productive for me. And a few days into my studying, I found that it was not being productive, and I was often forgetting some of the stuff that I had read. And then I started quizzing myself periodically instead of just reading a long chapter or reading a long section and hoping that I would remember it. I started breaking it down and actually quizzing myself, and it made it a lot more exciting and fun instead of just sitting down for 2 hours or 3 hours at a time and just reading.
Yeah, I think breaking it up, I'm going to parent them, but I think breaking it up is one of the key things, and working on what you're weak on. You don't necessarily need to make what you're strong stronger, but what is weak more strong.
I think one last thing also that didn't work for me was taking practice tests and not reviewing them. If you don't just go and take the test and see how you did, go back to those questions and figure out the material that you're lacking in, and that'll kind of give you a more accurate picture where you need to go moving forward, where you're weak.
And also frequent breaks. I know that they harp on us in dental school that you only really are learning the first 20 minutes or half an hour that you sit down and do something. So make sure like you don't need a long break, just go to the bathroom or go get a drink of water or something before you sit back down. If you're sitting there doing the same monotonous thing, you don't retain so much. So.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and then we have some closing slides as well as the Memorang promo code. The last question is, where can you find previously released exams?
I would Google it. It's been 4 or 5 years. I can do that, and maybe I can get the website to Brian to distribute.
That's fine. What we'll do is when we send the follow-up email to all the attendees, we'll include the link for that.
Sorry, Brian. Just going off of what Benny said, a lot of the ones you can find just from Googling. You can also check on SDN. People have posted links to PDFs of the released exams. Yeah, and those Google would be the first thing to go to.
Okay, I've listed all the panelists' emails, but don't worry, I'll list them again in the last slide if you didn't get a chance to write them all down. I'd like to thank you for participating for tonight's program, especially the panelists. Great job all around. To help us evaluate this program and the need for future programs, we'll be sending out a brief survey. We'd appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to fill this out. Please join for more webinars as DAT Week continues on. Tomorrow we'll be holding a webinar on dissecting the DAT, which will focus on the PAT and reading comprehension sections. And then next month we'll be holding a webinar on mastering the ADSAS, which will cover how to stand out on the dental school application. A Dean of Dental Admissions will be providing helpful tips on distinguishing yourself from other candidates. Please like us on Facebook at Facebook.com/ASDA Predental for DAT giveaways, daily tips, and sample DAT questions. I'm going to include these links as well at the end, don't worry. We encourage you to join the American Student Dental Association as a pre-dental member. Pre-dental membership offers discounts on DAT resources and benefits, particularly Memorang, access to publications, including our guide to getting into dental school, mentoring opportunities, personal statement, and interviewing resources. Dues are only $63, and you can join online at the URL on the screen. We'd like to thank our sponsors, particularly the American Dental Association, for once again supporting ASDA DAT Week, along with our prize sponsors, Crack the DAT, DAT Bootcamp, Gold Standard, Kaplan, and Memorang. And then here are the helpful links. We have the panelists' emails. We have the link to join. If you're interested in registering for dissecting the DAT, you can register at the link there. And then at the bottom, you'll see the Memorang link along with the promo code. So I'm going to leave this screen up for everybody to get a chance to copy. I'd like to thank everyone for attending tonight's program. You will be receiving a recording within a week of tonight. And then thanks again to the panelists for an excellent job. We really appreciate it. Thank you for your support of ASDA, and good night.